This is Detroit, once a prosperous metropolis that today represents everywhere prosperity has abandoned. Detroit's fall from economic might to a city where 1 in 4 people live in poverty has been so well chronicled that revisiting it again would serve no useful purpose. To simplify a tale that is excessively complex, Detroit had one of the world's strongest order manufacturing industries back in the day. Suddenly, Detroit wasn't a great place to make vehicles because of competition from overseas factories. Welcome to the Financial Fortune YouTube channel, your premier destination for in-depth analyses and insightful discussions on global economic trends. In today's video, we delve into a pressing issue that often goes unnoticed, the phenomenon of shrinking cities. Prepare to explore the intricate web of economic, social, and demographic factors contributing to this critical challenge. Join us as we uncover the big problem behind shrinking cities and gain a deeper understanding of its implications for economies, communities, and the individuals affected.
At one time, the 4th most populated city in the country and one of the wealthiest. Well, it's now becoming the largest city in American history to file for bankruptcy.
This has been absolutely devastating. This is a city that personifies urban blight.
They're going to have to put together a plan. I think there is still a question about what's going to happen with those pensions.
So the bankruptcy happened in 2013, a run-up of decades of mismanagement. Obviously, the financial crisis harmed pensions. So they had a $350+ million budget deficit. As well as $18 billion in long-term debt.
You know, I mean, the city for years had been taking in $1 billion in revenue and spending $1 billion too, and kept borrowing to make the difference until they ran into the legal borrowing limit, and the city ended up in bankruptcy.
One of the untold stories, I think, of the bankruptcy is the extent to which the period immediately leading up to it, the 3 or 4 or 5 years leading up to it, essentially set the framework for the bankruptcy to be effective. Because you don't want to go into a bankruptcy, clean out all your debts, and then find that you don't have enough to work with so that you just slide right back into bankruptcy.
The problem with the city getting to bankruptcy was the problems with revenue. It was a declining city. Places that have a single dominant industry, especially when it's based on consumers, tend to feel the pain a lot more deeply than diversified places.
And when financing dried up and people weren't able to get the loans they needed to buy cars, the auto industry tanked right along with that.
So the city filed the Chapter 9 bankruptcy protection, largest municipal bankruptcy in the history of the United States.
When Judge Rosen said that he needed $800 million to solve the bankruptcy, I just thought there is no way we can assemble that kind of money that quickly. But you had 2 major foundations located here, or who had high interest here, the Ford Foundation and Kresge. And the 2 foundations agreed that we would put the first money on the table. And if we put enough money on the table, we felt that we would sort of start in motion the willingness of others to do the same. So although $850 million is a huge number, when you get 8, 10, 12 different folks contributing to that, it's doable. And so I think what you saw in the first year or 2 after the bankruptcy was Mayor Duggan really going to work on the basics.
When I got elected, we needed to put on 500 lights a week to get neighborhoods lit. We had to buy new ambulances, we had to buy new buses, we had to train bus drivers.
But ultimately you need a quality of life that makes people have a reason to stay in Detroit or to come to Detroit.
How do we improve the city and not revisit the same failed policies?
The city of Detroit lost population and economic vitality as its auto sector contracted and its leaders were unable to successfully pivot to higher value businesses. Detroit's current population is around 1/3 of its peak population, but the city is not alone in its inability to recruit new citizens. Between the years 2013 and 2018, experts predict that the population of 25 global cities will fall. Between now and 2050, they estimate that 37 out of all cities will have shrunk in size. Those who can go will always do so. Those who are unable to leave, however, will discover that the city's public services are subpar. Cities throughout the world are scrambling to create measures to recruit new people in order to avoid becoming the next Detroit by having their economies and social structures collapse. These measures might be as mundane as tax rebates or as novel as new facilities. To encourage people to move to their communities, several rural districts in Japan, for instance, provide them with free houses. This drive to attract new inhabitants may, however, be misguided. There is no guarantee that any given city will see rapid expansion. By 2100, the United Nations predicts the world's population will have leveled out. You might think it's impossible for your city to shrink if you live in New York, Toronto, or San Francisco. It's possible that you're correct. Of course, that's what people in the middle of the 20th century thought of Detroit. So, when did cities start getting smaller? What makes cities that are declining look bad? And, lastly, can economic miracles happen in places that are shrinking? Our urban landscape will increasingly include diminishing cities, whether we like it or not. Perhaps we should stop resisting the trend and start being ready for it. Depopulation cities have existed for as long as there have been cities. Calamity wars, natural disasters, and starvation all contributed to the decline of imperial cities. For a few quick instances, consider the devastation of Carthage during the Third Punic War and the fall of Rome and the Roman Empire. In 1466, Paris was ravaged by the plague, and in 1666, London was destroyed by a devastating fire. City shrinkage might be transient, as in the case of London and Paris, or it can be permanent. Larger metropolises became the high-density behemoths we know them as today as a result of the Industrial Revolution, but before the 20th century, they were not always popular among scholars and policy officials. In fact, they received a great deal of backlash. Cities like Chicago grew so rapidly during the height of industrialization that city planners sometimes found themselves playing catch-up. About 4,000 individuals called Chicago home in 1840. After another 50 years, that figure grew to well over 1 million. Chicago's economy profited from the influx of new residents, but the city also had major hygiene issues as a result of housing shortages, infrastructural decay, and crowding. Sir Ebenezer Howard put up his plan for the Garden City in 1898. These settlements, with a combined population of 30,000, were planned to be smaller satellites of bigger cities. As Howard saw it, this Garden City could eliminate the drawbacks of both urban and rural living. Howard and others like him suggest that these cities were planned from the start to be the polar opposite of the typical cities of the period. They promoted small, tightly linked communities that cared for the environment. However, the late 20th century saw a paradigm change in urban planning. The world's once great manufacturing hubs had by then become its deindustrialization epicenters. These cities, such as Detroit in the United States and Manchester in the United Kingdom, had a significant outmigration to London and New York in the 1980s and 1990s. The collapse of the Soviet Union coincided with a similar shift in perspective. There was some playful competitiveness between Western and Eastern European cities. Many of these cities were experiencing competition for citizens for the first time, and they naturally lost. When urban planners realized that shrinking cities was a recipe for financial disaster, they shifted their attention from encouraging city contraction to encouraging city expansion. But why do towns that are losing population get a bad rap? The two main sources of income for most municipalities are property taxes and grants from the state or federal government. It is not typical practice in most nations, although local governments can raise funds through bond sales or income taxes in certain countries. It is a universal truth that when a city's population decreases, so do the property taxes collected by the government. To start with the most obvious benefit, having fewer people means collecting less money from property taxes. Second, and less obviously, fewer people means less demand for housing, which in turn means less money for the value of the properties that already exist. Current homeowners pay a total of since property taxes are calculated as a percentage of their home's worth. Detroit's property tax revenue has declined, therefore the city has raised its tax rate to make up the difference. The fact that modern-day Detroit has one of the highest effective property tax rates in the United States does not help the city's cause of attracting new residents. Cities rely on government financing second only to taxation, but because government funding is often proportional to a city's population, declining cities often see government funding decline as citizens depart. Detroit challenged the U.S. Census Bureau in court in 2022 for undercounting the city's population. The Bureau of Counting is allegedly threatening millions of dollars in funds to which the citizens of Detroit are entitled, according to the complaint filed by the city. Thus, declining city sizes lead to declining tax revenues. Nonetheless, many municipalities flourish while having budgets far smaller than New York City's. The issue arises when communities that are seeing their tax revenue decline are yet expected to provide the same level of service as they did when their tax revenue was significantly greater. Despite its declining population, Detroit is still responsible for 139 square miles since 1926. Contrast that with a city like San Francisco, which is home to 815,000 people but takes up a mere 46 square miles of land. However, San Francisco estimates that it will receive close to $14 billion in funding in the 2022 to 2023 fiscal year, while Detroit estimates that it would receive roughly $2.5 billion. This equates to $14 million per square mile in income for Detroit, but $280 million for San Francisco. When compared to Detroit's 139 square miles, San Francisco's 46 square miles are far simpler to maintain. The Detroit region has to be seen as equivalent in size. The city's infrastructure and services are becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as tax income declines. Damaged infrastructure, abandoned buildings, and subpar public services are common results. Damaged infrastructure makes it challenging to get new businesses to relocate there. Poor public services and the presence of abandoned structures encourage people to relocate to other cities with better living conditions. The loss of jobs is the second problem associated with the city's decline. Residents are more than capable of carrying out the tasks required by local businesses when population growth slows. Because of this, businesses may have to move to areas where they can't get workers. The people who stay in a city that is losing population tend to be older and less educated than the people who have the resources to leave. The lack of the human capital necessary for the development of businesses makes it difficult for the city to recruit new ones. The loss of tax money and jobs exacerbates an already precarious position, as the remaining residents are more likely to be from low-income backgrounds and more dependent on city services. Low-income families absorb a disproportionate share of the city's tax money, leaving little to reinvest in the community. As a result, urban decline accelerates due to a lack of investment in public infrastructure and efforts to lure new people, which implies social services need a bigger budget. The downward spiral therefore proceeds. Therefore, the contracting city enters a contracting trap from which it is exceedingly difficult to extricate itself. To what extent, though, do urban declines become economic wonders? For obvious reasons, many urban areas are making efforts to buck the national trend of urban decline. 3 of Detroit's major employers established the Live Midtown Incentive Program in 2011 to entice people to move into the neighborhood and encourage current residents to stay. Incentives ranged from free or reduced rent to interest-free loans for a down payment or an allowance to use toward home improvements. From 2011 to 2015, the program was effective. 1,000 people have moved into the region since Live Midtown opened. Even though Detroit has experienced a decline in population, this is still the case. It appears that people of all backgrounds benefited from Live Midtown's financial aid programs. Residents of Detroit have long been worried about gentrification as a result of corporate and government efforts to revive the city. It's not just an issue of whether or not incentives will work for every declining city, but whether or not policies are well thought out enough to help as many populations as feasible. Consider the country. Here in Japan. As an example, Japan has one of the world's lowest fertility rates. Japan also has one of the lowest immigrant populations among industrialized nations. Attracting people from different regions of Japan by offering affordable housing is a solid strategy. However, when the whole population of Japan is declining, communities vying for a decreasing pool of inhabitants does little to address the root causes of the problem: low birth rates and a lack of immigration. Of fact, local governments have little influence over national immigration policy. Incentives like loan cancellation or free housing can be useful, but they could also have negative side effects. The same holds true for decreasing cities. We shouldn't expect them to work in the long run if the decline is due to external sources. Perhaps, though, it isn't necessary to stop the decline of urban areas in the first place. Cities will continue to decline, it's a fact of life. We don't have to take it as a given that a city's shrinking population automatically means it's going to suffer economically. There are other factors to consider. The reduction of a country's population is often associated with its economic collapse. However, this is not always the case. The city of New Orleans is a perfect illustration of this separation of types. 27 of the 886 localities in the United States that shrank between 1980 and 2010 had median earnings above the area average, a 2019 study found. A larger percentage of citizens in these 97 rich declining cities have a bachelor's degree or higher than the area norm. No correlation is found between income and the rate of city shrinking, according to the same research. These numbers might make you scratch your head at first, but they're actually quite plausible. Cities that are losing population may appeal to certain people for the same reasons that they turn others off. Congestion on the roads is much reduced in cities that are losing population. Indeed, urban decline often results in a substantial increase in the number of unoccupied dwellings. This isn't an attempt to make anything look better than it is. The problems of declining cities, such as falling tax revenues and fewer available employment, remain. The goal here is to encourage city planners to take advantage of the benefits associated with declining rather than expanding metropolitan areas. Smart shrinkage may be considered after we adopt this perspective on city decline. Smart shrinkage is the concept that government officials should cut costs by constructing fewer dwellings, rather than more, in order to lure residents out of vacant neighborhoods and into publicly accessible parks. Put that money into parks instead of new highways. Shrinking cities might redirect resources to better maintain the infrastructure they formerly ignored by lowering the amount of infrastructure they are responsible for. Obviously, not every city in decline can succeed. Just as not every expanding metropolis will thrive. While some declining American cities, about 25%, are outperforming their counterparts, the remaining 75% are falling more and further behind. But we can learn from the best practices of these exemplary municipalities and model our efforts elsewhere. The study's authors noted that 86% of the rich disappearing communities were located near major urban centers. This highlights the need for a major city to provide resources to these outlying areas. Even though not every declining city can be next to a thriving metropolis, those that can benefit from closer linkages to nearby economic powerhouses can do so with help from higher levels of government. The Garden City concept, where smaller towns surround bigger cities, might serve as inspiration for future urban development. Remembering that Detroit formerly housed over 2 million people is important when discussing declining urban areas. According to projections, it was on course to become a major American city. Even the entire globe. Today's thriving cities may serve as examples of what not to do in the future. Those who find that outlook too bleak may benefit from the smart shrinking approach. There is no necessity for the economy to tank along with the population. Population growth can't continue indefinitely, thus it's smart to reduce numbers. Most urban areas will either decrease in size or have negligible population increase. In order to achieve environmental and social goals, such as lowering pollution levels or crime rates, smart shrinking repurposes existing urban areas. The growth mentality emphasizes continuous improvement, whereas this is the opposite. This brings us full circle, doesn't it? There was a time when academics and urban planners preferred low-density small towns to dense megacities. Cities are therefore compelled by deindustrialization and rivalry to adopt a growth mentality. The future may once again favor compact, low-density urban centers. As we conclude this eye-opening video, we are left with essential questions that prompt us to consider the future of shrinking cities. How can policymakers address the economic and social challenges these cities face? What strategies can be implemented to revitalize urban centers and ensure sustainable growth? How can individuals and communities actively participate in reshaping their cities for the better? The issue of shrinking cities is a call to action for comprehensive and innovative solutions. Stay tuned to the Financial Fortune channel for more enlightening discussions on critical economic matters. Remember, the revitalization of cities holds the potential to unlock new opportunities and create a brighter future for all. Until next time, may we work together to transform challenges into opportunities and foster thriving communities.